Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. The greatest crimes are not committed in darkness, but in broad daylight, by people who smile while they do it. There's something disturbingly theatrical about how they did you, not quietly, not discreetly, but loud, deliberate and bold, as if attacking an innocent person gave them a standing ovation in hell. Let's get one fact straight. According to psychological studies, people are 4 times more likely to believe a charismatic liar than a quiet truth-teller. And guess who you were? The quiet truth-teller. The one who showed up, did right, loved hard, gave deep, and still ended up being burned at the stake like the villain in their twisted fairy tale. And the worst part, they knew you were innocent. They knew you were genuine. They just didn't care. Because the story was juicier when you were the bad guy. People say, truth always comes out in the end, like it's a comforting bedtime story. But truth usually shows up late, mad, holding receipts and ready to blow up group chats. So now, here we are. The same people who laughed while you cried, who orchestrated your public takedown like it was a community sport, they're now stuttering, sweating and scrambling for alibis. Because the world's starting to realize you were the innocent one. And what they did to you was straight up disgusting. Let's talk about it. Let's peel back the mask, flip the script, and finally say what needed to be said from the very beginning. And, oh, if you're easily triggered by truth, this might not be the video for you, but if you're ready to see what divine vindication looks like, buckle up. Number 1, they demonized your purity because it highlighted their filth. They didn't hate you because you were wrong. They hated you because you were right. You didn't need to put on a mask or pretend to be something you weren't. You walked into rooms with your head high, your conscience clean, and your spirit intact. That's what disturbed them. You didn't owe anyone explanations for being a decent human being, but somehow your goodness became a spotlight on their filth. The way you treated people with fairness, honesty, and compassion made them uncomfortable, not because you were doing too much, but because they were doing too little. It's not that you tried to outshine anyone. In fact, you probably just wanted peace. But your presence highlighted what they had lost a long time ago: authenticity. They gave up their truth for applause, sold their morals for popularity, and shaped their lives around manipulation and masks. Then you walked in, no performance, no gimmicks, just real. And that was too much. You were a mirror they never asked for. And instead of confronting what they saw, they tried to smash the mirror and blame it for showing the cracks. They wanted to believe you were fake. They needed to believe you were hiding something. Because if someone could go through what you've gone through and still carry light, then what excuse did they have for becoming monsters in the name of survival? You became the unspoken proof that the soul can still be clean even after the storm, and that drove them mad. They needed you to fall. They prayed for your downfall behind fake smiles, and when it didn't come, they tried to create one. That's what makes it so twisted. You weren't even competing. You were just being. But in a world full of people who thrive on dominance, silence, and control, your innocence made too much noise. It shook the illusions they built their lives on, so they had to make you the enemy. Not because you were evil, but because you made them face the evil in themselves. They didn't just attack a person. They attacked a reminder that even in this dark world, purity still exists, and they couldn't stand it. Number 2, they chose character assassination because actual evidence didn't exist. They couldn't find any real dirt on you, so they had to create some. That's how desperate it got. When they realized there was no proof, no scandal, no smoking gun, they didn't back off. They doubled down, because the truth wasn't working in their favor. So they built a lie that could do the damage the facts never could, and they made it convincing. They dressed it up with fake concern, manipulated the timeline, left out important details, and sprinkled in just enough truth to make it sound believable. That's how character assassination works. It doesn't need evidence. It just needs volume and repetition. They didn't want people to think for themselves. They wanted them to feel something: anger, suspicion, distrust, anything that would turn the crowd against you. So they planted seeds in conversations, whispered your name in controversy, and asked fake questions like, "Don't you think it's strange how they always, knowing full well what they were doing?" They couldn't confront you directly because you didn't actually do anything wrong. And that's what frustrated them most. You had nothing to hide, so instead of exposing a secret, they had to create a story. What's worse is how quickly people believed it. not because it made sense, but because lies tend to spread faster than truth, especially when the truth is boring and the lie is entertaining. You became a topic, a rumor, a punchline. And the people who once smiled in your face started side-eyeing you, not because they knew anything for sure, but because someone with just enough influence whispered the wrong thing at the right time. It was never about truth. It was about control. They wanted to control how people saw you, how you were treated, how your name carried weight or lost it. And the fastest way to do that wasn't through honesty, it was through manipulation. The sad part? Most people didn't care if it was true. They just wanted to be part of the drama. But here's the thing, the truth doesn't panic, it doesn't scream for attention. It waits. And now that the lies are starting to fall apart, they're realizing they didn't just lie on you, they exposed themselves. Number 3, you were the scapegoat for their internal rot. They used you like a dumping ground, not because you deserved it, but because you were the safest place for their poison. You became the emotional trash can for people who refused to take responsibility for their own brokenness. Everything they didn't want to deal with, their guilt, shame, anger, jealousy, self-hatred, they poured it onto you like it was your job to carry it. They were hurting, but instead of healing, they projected. Instead of doing the work, they dumped it all on you and called you too sensitive when it crushed you. You weren't their problem, you were just available. You were the one who listened, the one who cared, the one who showed up when they needed someone to lean on. But when they needed someone to blame, you were still there. So they made you the target. It was convenient. You became the scapegoat for things that had nothing to do with you. If they felt insecure, they blamed your confidence. If they felt guilty, they called you judgmental. If they were angry at themselves, they snapped at you. It was never about you. It was always about what they couldn't face in themselves. They couldn't admit that they were the toxic ones. So they needed someone nicer, someone kinder, someone who wouldn't retaliate. And that was you. They counted on your silence. They relied on your compassion. They weaponized your empathy against you, and the more pain they pushed onto you, the lighter they felt. But you carried it all, not knowing why you always felt drained, anxious, or guilty for things that weren't yours to carry. What they did wasn't just unfair, it was emotional and spiritual abuse. They didn't just treat you like a trash bin, they treated your soul like it was disposable. And now that people are waking up to what really happened, it's starting to look ugly. Because the same ones who played victim are being seen for what they really are, manipulators who dumped their rot onto someone too pure to throw it back. You were never the problem, you were the mirror, and they shattered it because they couldn't stand to see themselves. Number 4, your innocence wasn't just misunderstood. It was intentionally targeted. They weren't guessing. They weren't mistaken. They knew exactly who you were. They saw the way you moved. With quiet strength, with integrity that didn't bend, with a spirit that didn't flinch under pressure. And that's what triggered them. It wasn't ignorance, it was intent. They weren't confused about your character. They were offended by it. Your innocence, your honesty, your refusal to play dirty made them feel exposed. So they made you a target, not because you did something wrong, but because you refused to become like them. They couldn't control you, and that's what made you dangerous in their eyes. You weren't driven by fear or validation or approval. You didn't flatter egos or shrink yourself to keep peace. You didn't fake friendships or chase cliques. That kind of freedom unnerves people who rely on manipulation to maintain power. Your authenticity disturbed their illusion of control, the one where they got to decide who rises and who falls, who's accepted and who's rejected, who gets love and who gets left behind. But you didn't need their system, you didn't play their game, and they hated you for it. So they didn't just misunderstand you, they hunted you. They poked, provoked, and plotted. They twisted your words, weaponized your kindness, and tried to flip your strength into weakness. Because if they could damage your reputation, they could regain the control they lost the moment you refused to fold. It was never about what you did, it was about what you didn't do. You didn't conform. You didn't participate in the lies. You didn't let their tactics shape you. And that made you untouchable, at least spiritually. But here's the twisted part. They respected your light just enough to fear it, but not enough to protect it. Instead of honoring what was rare in you, they tried to destroy it. They didn't want people to see what they saw, because if others recognized your truth, The whole fake empire they built would crumble. You weren't attacked because you were flawed. You were attacked because you were real. And in a world full of people hiding behind masks, being real is the biggest threat of all. Number 5, they needed you to be guilty. Because if you're innocent, they're monsters. They needed you to be guilty, even if they had to twist the story to make it so. Because if you were innocent, truly undeniably innocent, then everything they did to you becomes indefensible. Every lie, every setup, every smear, every betrayal, it all becomes proof that they weren't just wrong, they were cruel, and their egos couldn't survive that truth. So instead of facing their own darkness, they created a version of reality where your pain was deserved. They had to. Otherwise, they'd have to see themselves for what they really are. It wasn't about facts, it wasn't about logic, it was about narrative control. You were a problem they didn't want to solve. You were a truth they wanted to erase. And the easiest way to erase someone is to rewrite their character. So they turned your boundaries into disrespect, your silence into guilt, your detachment into arrogance. They crafted a story where you were the villain and they were just the poor souls trying to cope with your supposed behavior. It was a performance. But worse than that, it was strategic. They put on their best victim faces while quietly stabbing you in rooms you weren't allowed into. They cried about how hurt they were, just loud enough to drown out the evidence. Because if people ever took a closer look, if anyone ever asked real questions, the mask would fall. And behind it, pure calculation, jealousy, control, insecurity. But they couldn't afford that exposure. So you had to take the fall. You had to become the bad guy so they could keep wearing halos they never earned. That's the kind of evil that hides behind charm and concern. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't push, it manipulates. And it does everything in its power to avoid accountability. Because accountability would mean admitting you were the target, not the threat. And that truth would destroy the image they've worked so hard to protect. You weren't a villain, you were a mirror, and they couldn't stand what they saw, so they painted you black just to feel white again. But now the paint is fading, and the truth, it's loud. Number 6, you were a threat to their hierarchy of hypocrisy. You were a problem for them the moment you refused to play by their rules. Not because you were aggressive, not because you were disrespectful, but because you were real. You walked into their carefully built system of fakeness and didn't bow your head. You didn't try to impress anyone. You didn't play along with their power games. You didn't flatter egos, chase validation, or stay silent just to keep your seat at the table. That made you dangerous, because people like you expose everything fake without even trying. Their entire structure was built on pretending, status over substance, image over integrity. It was all about who you knew, how well you performed, and how much you were willing to sacrifice your truth for acceptance. And then you showed up, not asking for permission, not begging for inclusion, and still shining. That disrupted everything, because you weren't supposed to stand tall unless they gave you permission. You weren't supposed to speak unless they approved of your voice. But you spoke. You stood. You moved through their ranks with nothing but authenticity, and it shook them. They hid behind titles, positions, fake smiles, and mutual secrets. But you didn't need any of that. You didn't gossip to get ahead. You didn't lie to fit in. You didn't act one way in public and another behind closed doors, and that terrified them. Because a person who cannot be bribed, bought, bullied, or broken is a serious threat to a system built on fear and manipulation. You weren't supposed to be bold. You weren't supposed to be free. You weren't supposed to be you, not without their approval. And when they realized they couldn't control you, they tried to label you too difficult, too intense, too honest, but none of it stuck. Because you were never interested in fitting in. You were too focused on standing firm, and that's what they couldn't handle. You didn't threaten their safety, you threatened their lies. You didn't try to destroy their world. Your truth simply exposed how false it really was. You didn't challenge their position. Your presence challenged their foundation. And once people started noticing the difference between real and fake, the whole structure started shaking. Number 7. They used collective gaslighting to turn sanity into suspicion. They couldn't take you down alone, so they recruited a crowd. That's how collective gaslighting works. It's not just one person twisting the truth, it's a whole network pushing the same lie until it starts to sound believable. They didn't just want to confuse you, they wanted to confuse everyone, because as long as people questioned you, they wouldn't question them. That was the goal. flipped the script so thoroughly that the innocent looked guilty and the guilty walked away clean. They started with small jabs, little comments, subtle shade. Don't you think they're a little too nice? There's just something about them I can't put my finger on. I don't know. Something feels off. These statements weren't based on facts. They were planted to stir suspicion. And the more they repeated them, the more people started wondering if maybe it was true. Because when enough people whisper the same doubt, it starts to echo like a fact. Your kindness became a tactic. Your honesty was framed as aggression. Your silence, which was you trying to protect your peace, became the evidence they used to paint you as cold or guilty. They flipped everything good about you into a weapon against you. That's how manipulation hides in plain sight. They didn't have proof, but they had volume. They didn't have integrity, but they had numbers. And people often believed the loudest voices, not the most truthful ones. You started to feel like you were in a world where nothing made sense, where the more honest you were, the more you were doubted, where no matter what you said, it could be twisted. That's not paranoia, that's psychological warfare. That's what happens when people work together to rewrite your reality, not because you're unstable, but because your stability threatened theirs. And the wildest part? None of it was accidental. It was planned, it was maintained, it was rehearsed. Because if people ever saw you clearly, if they really paid attention to your character, your consistency, your spirit, the entire web of lies would collapse. And deep down, they knew it. So they did everything they could to blur the vision, to muddy the waters, and to make you doubt the very light you carry. Number 8, your presence threatened the whole system of lies they lived in. You didn't walk in trying to start a war. You were just being yourself. But your presence alone shook everything they thought was secure, not because you were loud or aggressive, but because you were truthful in a space that was built on lies. You didn't even have to speak most of the time. Just being there, holding your ground, standing in your own integrity, made people uncomfortable. And not just slightly. It unsettled them at the core because the truth you carried made their fake reality start to crack. They had created an entire system based on image, manipulation, and secrets. Years of pretending. Years of looking the part without being the part. Years of backdoor deals, silent betrayals, and unspoken agreements to protect the illusion. And then you showed up, unbothered, unbought, and unwilling to bow. That was a threat. Not to their physical safety, but to the mental fortress they had built to hide from their own emptiness. You didn't follow their script, you didn't worship their titles, you didn't laugh at their fake jokes or sit quietly when something was wrong. You lived by truth, and that was too much. Because truth exposes everything, especially the parts people work the hardest to hide. You didn't have to accuse anyone, just your presence was enough to reveal what was off. And instead of being inspired to grow, they panicked, so they tried to shut you down. Not through open confrontation, but through labels. They called you difficult, arrogant, rebellious, antisocial, anything that would discredit you without having to deal with what you actually stood for. Because if people listened to you, if they saw what you saw, if they woke up like you had, the whole system would collapse. The lies would lose their power. The fear would lose its grip. The control would dissolve, and they couldn't afford that. You weren't just an outsider, you were a collapse waiting to happen. They saw it. They felt it. And instead of changing, they chose to attack. Because when someone carries truth that powerful, it doesn't just make people uncomfortable. It makes everything built on falsehood start to tremble. And that's exactly what you did. You were the shift they couldn't stop. Number 9, they abused you publicly, then claimed you embarrassed them. They made a spectacle out of hurting you, and then had the audacity to act like you were the one who crossed the line. They humiliated you in ways both loud and subtle, mocking you in front of others, disrespecting you behind your back, twisting your words, and stripping you of your dignity, all while making sure there were witnesses. And when you finally reacted, when your pain showed, when your silence turned into distance or your tears into boundaries, they flipped the story and said you were the one causing a scene. That's how twisted it got. They abused you, then turned around and called you dramatic. They shamed you, then accused you of being too sensitive. They disrespected you, then told people you were the one who lacked respect. It was a masterclass in deflection. They would harm you and then act offended that you showed any emotion. You bleeding was more embarrassing to them than the fact that they stabbed you in the first place. They were never concerned about how they made you feel. They were only concerned about how you made them look. Because the moment your truth started leaking through, in your body language, in your tone, in the way you withdrew, it threatened their image. So they needed to act quickly. Damage control, reputation management. And the easiest way to do that was to blame you for reacting to the pain they caused. And here's where it gets even sicker. They didn't just believe their own lies. They convinced other people to believe them too, people who never saw the full story, people who didn't know the context, people who only saw your reaction, not the years of disrespect that led up to it. They made sure the audience saw a version of you that looked unstable, bitter, or mean, all while they played calm, concerned, and confused. It was manipulation at its finest. You didn't embarrass them, you exposed them, and they couldn't handle it. So they tried to flip the blame before anyone figured out the truth. They weren't the victims. They were the performers in a cruel, calculated show. And you were the one who finally stopped clapping. Number 10, you were the living proof that good still exists. And that was unbearable. You didn't have to preach, prove, or push anything. Just by being who you are, you disrupted their entire worldview. You were the living proof that good people still exist, and that shook them, because for years they had built their identity around the belief that everyone is fake, selfish, and out for themselves. That belief justified how they treated people. It made it easier to live without guilt, but you were the exception they couldn't ignore. You stood for everything they had abandoned. While they talked about loyalty like it was weakness, you lived it like a code. You didn't flip on people the moment things got hard. You didn't take shortcuts or switch up to gain favor. You showed up. You stayed real. You didn't just say the right things. You did them, even when no one was watching. And that made them uncomfortable, because it forced them to see how far they had fallen from who they pretended to be. They didn't want a reminder. They wanted an excuse. They needed the world to be dark so they could feel justified in their darkness. They needed to believe that kindness was always fake, that honesty was always manipulation, that love was always transactional, because that's how they operated. And then you came along. And without even trying, you exposed their whole facade. You didn't exploit people. You protected them. You didn't gossip. You covered others, even when they didn't deserve it. You didn't seek revenge. You walked away with your dignity intact. Your existence wasn't just different, it was convicting. It reminded them that they had a choice, and they chose cruelty. They chose pettiness. They chose bitterness. You didn't make them cruel. You made it harder for them to pretend they weren't. You didn't fit their narrative, so they tried to destroy yours. Because if someone like you can go through everything you've gone through and still stay pure-hearted, then what's their excuse? If you can walk through fire and not turn cold, then what does that say about the ones who turned bitter over far less? You were the proof they didn't want to see. That good still exists, that love is still real, and that the problem wasn't life. It was them. Number 11, their attack wasn't just physical or emotional, it was spiritual treason. What they did to you wasn't just cruel, it was spiritually reckless. They didn't just cross a boundary with a human being, they trespassed on something sacred. Your life isn't ordinary, whether they understood it or not. There is a divine assignment on you, a purpose, a calling, a light that you carry that is not self-made but God-given. And when they attacked you, they weren't just attacking a person, they were challenging something much bigger. They were violating something holy. Some people think they're just being petty. They think their jealousy, gossip, and betrayal are just part of normal life. But when you are chosen, when you are walking in alignment with a higher plan, those actions carry serious weight. Their words weren't just mean, they were curses spoken against something anointed. Their schemes weren't just personal, they were acts of rebellion against divine order. Whether they meant to or not, they stepped into a war they weren't qualified for, and the consequences, they don't get to control them. It wasn't just emotional damage, it was spiritual treason. They mocked what they didn't understand. They touched what they weren't authorized to touch. You weren't just another person they could tear down and walk away from. You were connected to something sacred, something eternal. And when people lay hands, physically, verbally, or spiritually, on someone who has been set apart by God, they trigger a response that is outside of human control. It may not come immediately, but it always comes. That's why some of them are now facing losses they can't explain, closed doors they thought were wide open, restless nights, strange disruptions in their lives, because they thought they were just targeting you. They didn't realize they were stepping into a spiritual contract they never read. They came against someone innocent, not knowing that heaven had already marked your name. And when you harm the innocent with malice, with intention, with pleasure, there is a cost. Not because you wished it on them, but because universal law doesn't let that go unpaid. They thought they were getting away with it. But spiritual consequences don't need cameras or courts. They operate in silence, and they are always right on time. Number 12, you were tried in the court of cowards with no right to defend yourself. You never got a chance to speak. The verdict was decided before you even knew you were on trial. You were judged by people who never had the courage to ask you anything directly, who never gave you the dignity of a conversation. Instead, they relied on whispers, side comments, assumptions, and hearsay. And once the story gained momentum, it was no longer about what was true. It was about what was useful. They didn't want clarity. They wanted a conclusion that made them feel comfortable, even if it meant lying on your name. They treated rumors like facts and silence like guilt. The same people who claimed to value truth didn't want to hear yours, because the moment you started speaking your side, they would have to face the possibility that they were wrong. And for many of them, admitting that would hurt more than believing a lie, so they shut you out. They kept the conversation going without you, like spectators in a courtroom where you were the accused and the entire jury was made up of cowards. You were surrounded by people who lacked the spine to stand alone in truth, so they hid behind the safety of the crowd. They used fake neutrality as a cover for betrayal. They said things like, "I don't want to take sides," while passively allowing your name to be torn apart. They watched your character be dissected by people who never even tried to understand it, and they said nothing. Silence became agreement. Distance became alignment. And all the while, you were left standing in the middle of a storm that you never caused. The worst part, they expected you to swallow it, to take it as a lesson, to stay humble, to forgive quickly so they could avoid accountability. But what they failed to realize is that every lie they told, every conversation they had behind your back, every time they let your name be dragged through the dirt, it was recorded. Maybe not by cameras, but by the divine. They thought you were finished. They thought the story was closed. But truth has a strange way of surviving. It may move slowly, but it moves with purpose. And now, while their version of the story is falling apart, your truth is still standing, quiet, solid, unshaken. Because when you are innocent, time always testifies on your behalf. Number 13, they didn't want justice. They wanted blood that wouldn't stain their hands. They never wanted fairness. They never wanted to understand. What they wanted was destruction, but without having to carry the guilt of delivering it directly. So they moved in the shadows. They stirred the pot, then stepped back and watched it boil over, pretending they had nothing to do with the mess. They whispered just enough to turn people against you, but stayed far enough away so no one could trace it back to them. That was the game. They wanted you to fall, but they didn't want to look like they pushed you. They didn't throw punches. They just handed out the weapons. They let others speak for them, fight their battles, and dirty their hands, while they sat back looking composed and concerned. They used gossip as a form of warfare. They spread doubt in strategic places, planted suspicion in fragile minds, and let the rest do the work for them. If anyone called them out, they played innocent. I was just worried. I'm only saying this because I care. But underneath those sweet-sounding words was malice with a smile. They weren't looking for justice. Justice would require honesty, accountability, and truth. Things they were never willing to face. They weren't interested in resolution. They wanted to see you suffer. They wanted to see you isolated, misunderstood, and stripped of everything that made you feel safe and seen. And when life hit you hard, whether it was emotionally, financially, spiritually, or mentally, they didn't offer real support. They celebrated quietly. They nodded to each other in secret, because in their minds, your pain confirmed the story they had been selling all along. And yet they still wanted to look like good people. That was the sickest part. They wanted your blood on the ground without a single stain on their hands, so they washed their image while your name got dragged. They threw stones and hid behind smiles, and while others thought they were staying neutral or being mature, they were actually orchestrating your downfall from a distance. But the truth is starting to surface. People are beginning to ask questions, and the ones who cheered for your pain in silence are now terrified because they know what's coming. You may have bled, but you didn't break. And the same people who tried to destroy you without getting dirty are about to be exposed completely for who they've been all along. Number 14. Their hands are now stained with the guilt of touching God's anointed. There's a difference between hurting just anybody and hurting someone with divine protection. They didn't just come for you, they touched something sacred, something set apart. They didn't realize that when they attacked you, they were poking at a force far greater than you, because you weren't moving through life alone. You were moving under divine assignment. And when someone tries to tear down what God has appointed, they're not just committing cruelty, they're committing spiritual treason. They thought it was just gossip, just a rumor, just a few harmless digs. They thought your breakdowns were amusing, your tears were weakness, your silence was defeat. But every time they mocked your pain or ignored your cries, they weren't just stacking up cruelty, they were writing their own sentence, because there's a divine order to things, and it always balances. They may have delayed your justice, but they could never cancel it. They wanted the world to see you as a failure. Instead, the world is starting to see them for what they are: manipulators in masks, cowards in costumes of concern. They hope to bury you in silence, but their schemes are now echoing so loud even the deaf can hear them. The truth always outlives the lie. And now the truth is erupting like a volcano that's been boiling under pressure for too long. And here's the reality. Whether they confess or not, whether they ever say sorry or not, karma is not waiting on their apology. It's already moving. The law of sowing and reaping does not take bribes. Every word, every act of betrayal, every spin of the truth they used against you, it's recorded. And the divine doesn't miss a detail. So while they pretend to still be in control, their own lives are unraveling, their own peace is evaporating. They're haunted not by you, but by the truth they tried to bury. Because once you harm someone who was sent by God, someone innocent, pure-hearted, and walking in obedience, you don't just face consequences from people. You answer to heaven. Their hands are stained, their masks are cracking. And the same people who once watched you suffer are now watching in disbelief as the tables turn. You may not have gotten justice in their system, but heaven already ruled in your favor, and that verdict, irreversible. What they did to you was never just petty. It was a calculated, soul-deep attack on someone who walked with divine purpose. They tried to rewrite your story with lies, smear your character with projection, and bury your innocence beneath a mountain of manipulation, all to protect the fragile illusions they built their lives on. But no lie lasts forever, and no weapon formed against the truth can outrun its consequences. They didn't just offend you, they offended what you carry. They touched sacred ground with dirty hands, and now they're reaping what they sowed, not because you sought revenge, but because the universe has eyes, and God doesn't sleep. The same mouths that falsely accused you are now stammering under the weight of exposure. The same hands that tried to tear you down are now trembling from the fallout of divine justice. You weren't crazy. You weren't the villain. You were the light in a room full of cowards who preferred the dark. And now, one by one, their illusions are collapsing. The masks are off. The tables are turning. And the very people who once clapped for your downfall are now choking on their silence. Let them watch, let them whisper, let them squirm. Because you never needed to fight dirty to win. You stood your ground, stayed true to yourself, and let the truth do what it always does: rise. If this message stirred something deep in you, don't just sit with it, stand with it. Your story, your truth, and your voice matter more than ever. So let's build a space where the real ones rise and the masks fall. Subscribe to the channel. This isn't just content, it's a movement. Like the video if you felt seen, heard, or empowered. Comment below. Your story could be the breakthrough someone else needs. Share this with someone who's been silenced, doubted, or betrayed. They need to hear this. Truth tellers, light carriers, and chosen souls, that this space is yours. Let's keep the fire burning. God bless you.